Thanks very much, folks, for coming out on a very cold evening. So I'm just going to talk to you today, this evening, about my research on Newtown Jerpoint and its hinterland. And I'll go through some of the aspects of the research which I thought would be most interesting to include in this presentation. First, I have to acknowledge the support and funding from the Walsh Scholarship Programme, the Teagasc Walsh Scholarship Programme, and the Heritage Council of Ireland. As Paddy said, I did the research through UCD in Dublin and recently completed that PhD. So I'm going to go through a couple of aspects of the site, starting with the reasons why I think Newtown Jerpoint was established as a town in the location that it was founded, and how it was laid out and set out by its founders. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the buildings, but principally the church in the town, the medieval parish church of St. Nicholas. And then finally, I'll go through the chronology of the town's decline and its eventual desertion. So just for those who aren't too familiar with Newtown Jerpoint, it was a planned medieval settlement with borough status. It was founded around 1200 on the banks of the River Nore, within the canton of Knocktofer, near to Cistercian Abbey of Jerpoint Abbey, which was in the canton of Ogilvy. And this, just an important point, I suppose, to make at the beginning is that the Abbey and the town were in different political territories, so they weren't in the same manner. The bridge in the town was built on the side of a natural ford, which was an important connection point on the regional transport river network, and that was probably the principal reason why the town was established in that location. It grew to have a population of about 120 by the end of the 13th century and declined throughout the medieval period before becoming deserted in the post-medieval period. And that is its location here, so just a few kilometres upriver of Thomastown, on the confluence of or as you call it, the confluence, where the Little Argyll River joins in with the Nore River. So in terms of previous investigations on Newtown Jerpoint, the first one is an article by Reverend James Graves in Proceedings, the Journal of the Historical and Archaeological Association of Ireland, all the way back in 1868. And in this article, he describes an investigation which was carried out by the owner of the land at the time, Edmund Hunt, who, while looking for sand in the field of the town, came upon one of the houses and decided to have a little informal excavation, and they exposed one of the houses and made a few finds which seemed to come from probably the end of the town's occupation, so probably the 17th century. Wanted to find some Castlecomer anthracite, a glass bottle, a key, things like that, so quite late in the town's history. Then about 90 years later, W.J. Pillsworth wrote an article in the Old Kilkenny Review, kind of summing up some of the history of the town and discussing mainly its history, and just a nice little review of the knowledge that's up to that point on the town. And then 1973, the first and so far only excavation to have taken place, not within the town, but about 300 metres to the west of Newtown Jerpoint. Clare Foley excavated a couple of structures which dated to the probably early 13th century. And that's a significant excavation. There's some interesting evidence which I'll talk about later on. In 1997, Ben Murtagh did a survey of the church, and that's again in the Old Kilkenny Review. Unfortunately, at the time, it was covered pretty heavily in ivy, which thankfully has been removed. So I was able to revisit the church and have another look at the architecture and pick it apart. And then, pretty importantly, then 2007, the Heritage Council commissioned a Heritage Conservation Management Plan, and that was published in 2007 and authored by Julian Mundy. And it's a really great source of basically, he puts together the history of the town really well. It was a very useful source for me doing the PhD research from the history side of things. And in that year it was published also the Discovery Programme carried out a Lidar survey on the site, which again, that data was made available to me. So I have to appreciate that as well from the Discovery Programme. And lastly then, just before I started PhD research, Ian Doyle and Tycho O'Keefe published an article in Ruralia, Silent Witness, which would outline some of the key questions about the town, which kind of were begging to be asked. So this is an aerial view of Newtown Jerpoint. It's not the greatest image. It doesn't really pop from this image, but you can still see this is the long street through the town. It's called the Long Street in historical records. This is the site of the bridge, and this is the ford. You can kind of see the river is slightly shallower here. Well, it's a good bit shallower here, and it's not too clear from this image, but we'll have another look at another image. But this is the side of the bridge, and led onto the long street. Kind of the trees sort of delineate the line of the street. And there was another street then curving around here and down towards the parish church, St. Nicholas's parish church. This is Belmore House or Belmore Lodge, which was built around 1780 by Lord Belmore of Castlecoolin, Fermanagh. And further south on the other side of the river is Jerpoint Abbey, which we all know. And so off of the streets then are your typical burgage plots, which are, common, typical of medieval towns. Every medieval town that had borough status had these long, narrow plots, and the tenants would have held these plots for a rent of about £1 a year, and with it came generally a few acres in the manor as well, and they held it by, so they had to pay £1 a year, and they owed service at the Lord's Mill and court and that kind of thing. So that's all kind of typical of a medieval borough settlement. And it's pretty, Newtown Jerpoint is pretty exemplary in the fact that it's quite clear, on the ground, whereas a lot of these deserted sites, we don't see them until we do geophysics, which I did as part of the PhD, just to see what else was under the surface. So this is the Lidar survey then processed into an image, and it's much clearer. Things really pop in this image. You can see the long street travelling all the way through as the main thoroughfare oriented along the Little Argyll River. This depression here is where the bridge was going across, and we can see the east-west street curving around, and that's something which we question why does it curve in that manner, which is something I managed to answer, and I don't have the image in this slideshow, but I have an image of a digital surface model which shows basically the reason that it curves is because the ground rises kind of sort of imperceptible when you're on the surface, but in this image it looks quite clear. The ground rises, so they basically just took the path of least resistance around the rise of ground when plotting out this street, and then the street continues along, and it gives access to the parish church and graveyard here. And it seems to kind of end here, but it's possible that the path continued on over this little hill here upon which the Belmore House is built. And then the plots are really clear as well. These burnish plots, which are particularly interesting, and these ones here running off the long street, the Abbey down there, as I said. This is another road going west from the bridge towards Old Town, which, we would presume, because this is Newtown, Old Town was the site of an already existing settlement. So, and that's the direction where this road goes, and I have another image later on which shows where that road kind of continues on towards. So, yeah, by way of historical context, kind of tie the establishment of Newtown Jerpoint into an historical narrative. The Anglo-Norman lordship of Kilkenny. So after the Anglo-Norman conquest, the lands they conquered were distributed through sub-infeudation, the creation of manors, and this economy relied on the production and exportation of arable crops like oats and wheat and rye and barley and that kind of stuff. So the tenant of the manor then needed their manor to be profitable in order to sustain the military service which they owed to their lord. That was their terms of their tenure they had. So if they had a manor, that manor was supposed to provide enough income to equip and train a knight, or however many knights the manor was held for. And this all required fertile land, people to work it, peasants basically, a trade network of markets, transport routes, ports, for the export generally of unprocessed agricultural goods and the import of mostly luxury goods. Then more specifically in relation to Newtown Jerpoint, it can be looked at in the context of William Marshall's activities in Kilkenny when he took over his lordship. So it was either founded directly by William Marshall, and even if it wasn't, it could have been founded by the Baron of Knocktofer. William Fitzgriffin was the first Baron of Knocktofer. But either way, it's a town which existed because of William Marshall's activities. So prior to William Marshall, the colony in Ossory, the Kingdom of Ossory, was largely confined to the south of the lordship, the cantreds of Knocktofer and Iverk, and Newtown Jerpoint was a part of the barony of Knocktofer, at least until it was taken into the domain of William Marshall. Marshall then, when he took over, he rebuilt Kilkenny Castle, he made land grants to his followers, and founded the seaport of New Ross to compete with Waterford as an alternative to Waterford, to avoid the king's taxes in the royal port. His followers would establish their own towns, such as Thomastown, founded by Thomas FitzAnthony, and this led to a network of settlements and the increased flow of trade along the Nore. So prior to all of this, there really wasn't much of a flow of trade along the River Nore. All these towns hadn't yet been established. Thomastown and Inistioge, Kilkenny had been burned previously. So when Marshall took over his lands in Ireland, he said about all of this. But I suppose the point then being is that not all of these settlements were created equally or for the same purpose. So while you have Thomastown on the river, Inistioge on the river, Newtown Jerpoint on the river, they weren't all necessarily competing with each other for the same profit, for the same exploitation of trade or that. So if you juxtapose Thomastown and Newtown Jerpoint, it kind of creates a narrative of interdependence rather than competition. Thomastown had the natural affordances which allowed it to function as an inland port. So just go back to that image. If you have boats coming into New Ross, unloading at New Ross, large ships, and then smaller barges taking goods further up the river to Thomastown. So Thomastown was located at the tidal head of the river, the limit of the river. This as far as large barges could travel. It had deep waters for quaysides, and as you can see, it was roughly equidistant between New Ross and Kilkenny. And yeah, it had both land and river routes. So the reason I'm talking about Thomastown is, well, it's often been kind of, comparisons often made, or the interpretation has often been put forward that Newtown Jerpoint failed whereas Thomastown succeeded, as if they were both trying to accomplish the same thing. Whereas Newtown didn't have any of these affordances. It had the ford. So it was an ideal location for a bridge. So Newtown was basically there to connect the south and west of the county with Thomastown, and trade then onwards to New Ross, and from there to foreign ports like Bristol and so on. So going back to saying, as I say, Newtown Jerpoint can be understood within the context of William Marshall's strategic reorganisation of the lordship of Kilkenny and increased trade on the River Nore during, the 1190s, early 1200s. 1190s is probably the earliest decade Newtown and Thomastown and these towns might have been set up, but possibly the first decade of the 13th century. So with all that in mind, if we think about the planning of Newtown Jerpoint and what was in the minds of the people who decided we're going to set up a borough settlement in Newtown Jerpoint, or at this location, what was already there was one of the questions. And the reason I suspected something was already there is something that was pointed out in Doyle O'Keefe's article. Not sure which of them can take credit for this particular, figuring this out or pointing this out, but it was these curving plot boundaries which they decided resembled celians, which are the curving earthworks, reverse S-shaped earthworks, which are the result of ridge and furrow ploughing. Now, ridge and furrow ploughing this early in Newtown's, in the history of the landscape, would be unusual. It's something that's credited, that the Anglo-Normans are normally credited for introducing into Irish agriculture. But if this is the case, and it certainly does seem to be the case, that these are celians and that they were incorporated into the town, means they obviously they predate the town. And it's not an unusual thing. There are examples of medieval settlements in England where the town's plots are also incorporate agricultural cultivation ridges from previous, from before the villages were established. So there is precedence for that kind of thing. And why else? Why, if you're setting out a town on a blank landscape, why create these curving plots when they're perfectly capable of creating straight lines, which we see on the plots along Long Street? So the other thing as well is that excavation that was done by Claire Foley just about 300 metres west of here. She determined that the earliest phase of occupation over there was overlaying plough soil as well, and quite a good depth of plough soil, which contained pottery, ham green pottery, which can date from the 12th century to the mid 13th century. So there's pretty strong evidence in my mind that Newtown Jerpoint was founded on a landscape that was already under agricultural cultivation, which would raise the question of where the actual farm was itself. The farmstead must have been pretty nearby. So if we look at the first edition 6-inch map, we see these big square plots. Now, that's not typical of a medieval borough. Generally, the plots are all long and narrow, the burgage plots, and they're all pretty regular generally. Now, I know this map was surveyed in the late 1830s, so a lot had changed, obviously, but I figured with the geophysics we'll see if these plots had previously been longer, narrow plots and then been amalgamated over time, or what the story was there. There's also this plot here, which is quite large and irregular, and it contains a mill house, which there's 2 mill houses on the river, wheel houses, and this one is the earlier of the 2, and based on the fabric of the building. Now, it could be also part of an earlier previous agricultural settlement at the site. So if we just look side by side the Lidar and the magnetic map. So this is the magnetometry survey that was done. And first of all, just quickly look at this here. So this is that street going towards Old Town, which also must predate the town, because if this is remnants of ridge and furrow ploughing, then this is the headland created by the ploughing. And this headland respects this east-west running road, which would put the road also earlier than the town. These plots are here, right? Just look at the magnetometry results. So there's no sign that these plots were previously divided. In fact, it looks like this plot ran further this direction and was actually it was either a bigger square or there was more than one square enclosure. And the front boundary of this plot, and these black lines indicate ditches, so they're magnetically positive, which is a result of ashes, burnt material, but generally what collects in the ditch after it's been filled. And this line, this front boundary, is actually out on the right in the middle of the street, which suggests that the street was realigned. And you can see another boundary here, so it looks like there was a path or a road running in front of these plots that was realigned, and that caused the truncation of the front of these plots. Also, if you look at this east-west street, it curves around, so that if you bear in mind this is earlier than the town, if all things considered, it curves around like this, as if it's trying to avoid going through these plots. Again, it all seems to suggest that this is an earlier stage of settlement that preceded the laying out of the town. And all these little elements, the incorporation of these ceiling into the plot layout, the curving of the east-west street around the kind of humping the ground rather than going through it, and the incorporation of these plots, it would suggest that convenience was more of a priority than really any particular vision for a town that was going to thrive and that needed to be laid out in a way that was kind of conducive to trade or anything, growth or anything like that in a serious way. And the same could be said about the street pattern of Newtown Jerpoint. It's a linear street pattern, but not only is it linear, it's also oriented, as I said, along the Little Argyll River, not along the length of the Nore. So it's oriented between the bridge which led to Thomastown and the gate. If you're in Thomastown and you go along, I think it's the railway, the street going towards the railway road. That was the gate that would have led eventually to the bridge at Newtown. So go this way, you pass out this way, and this road would have taken you to Knocktopher. So it served the route between Knocktopher and Thomastown. This street here then went to Old Town, this road here, and this road or this street brought people to the parish church, and this little lane brought people down to the mill. But it was a street pattern that really just encouraged passage through the town. It was a market as well, small local market. But the fact that the market doesn't really leave a particularly strong impression on the layout of the town. I suspect, others have suspected it's at the junction of the two streets, because it's the most logical location for when there is the remains of a market cross, but it's in the graveyard. Maybe this triangular area here was a market, but the most likely area is here at the junction. But either way, it's a kind of a linear, and as well. So this is my kind of conjectural idea of where the boundaries of it was. Now, it wasn't unlike Thomastown, which was walled, Newtown was never walled. So it's not certain what kind of a boundary it had physically. It may have had a bank and a ditch. It may have had a bank surmounted by a palisade. It obviously had the river, the Little Argyll River to the east, the north to the north. There's some deep drainage ditches here, which might reflect the original line of the boundary here. And again, down along here, there's a bit of a kind of a bank, earthwork bank here, and that's on the 6-inch map as well as a field boundary. But then it disappears here. But when on the geophysics, a very slight bank and ditch anomaly shows up, and these parallel. And this could be a result of cultivation as well, but it ends here, it ends along this line, and it joins up neatly where this old field boundary used to be. So that's probably the southern extent of the village or the town. But even when you just take in the area where down here, these could be plots, but there's no evidence there's actually houses in these plots. There's not a huge amount of activity on the geophysics. Some anomalies here, but and look, there could be houses if we investigated with excavation. But generally, if we just look up here to where where we know there are houses, this is actually a huge area, and as I say, it exceeds the size of Thomastown by over a third, when you consider just the walled area of Thomastown, and that's a curious thing as well for a town that, it wasn't intended to rival Thomastown. But it does make sense in another way. So again, if we look at the street pattern of Thomastown, it's a grid. That's something that was deliberately set out for people to circulate through the town, through the main street, which is the marketplace. The parish church was here, down Logan Street, I think it is, and down to where the quays were. And that's the gate here out towards, I think it's Gallow Gate out towards Kilkenny. It's a different kind of approach to town planning. That's something that was very much in the mind of the planners, whereas Newtown is a linear street pattern. As I said, the burgage plots in Jerpoint are also very wide. They're also huge compared to those at Thomastown, which are only about 9.5 or 9.7 meters wide. The average plot width in Jerpoint was 18 meters wide. So there's some fairly straightforward, I think, explanations for this. So I said that a few times. It's greater street length. So yeah, in Thomastown, the gridded kind of street pattern, or partially gridded, is one square, but it meant there was a greater street length in a smaller area, and it had the narrower plot lengths or widths encouraged or enabled a greater number of plots along these streets. Conversely, Newtown's population relied more on agriculture, and perhaps the people required larger plots, larger gardens, because they weren't involved in trade like the people in Thomastown were, and crafts and that kind of thing. The linear street pattern prioritised the movement of people through the town rather than around it, direction to and from the bridge from Knockhofer to Thomastown and back again. So Thomastown's population density was higher, and as was its capacity for population growth. Therefore, it appears that Newtown Jerpoint and Thomastown were planned and laid out with considerably different outlooks, and that's the main interpretation from looking at and comparing the two towns and their early layouts. Just briefly, and I won't stick on this too long, but in terms of Newtown's connectivity then within the manor of Newtown Jerpoint, it was connected with by this road which ran along the west side of the Little Argyll to Knockhofer, and only some of that road still remains. A lot of it has disappeared. And then this road going west through Old Town as far as Innisnag, Stonyford, and it connected up. So it was all connected. The whole northern portion of the manor here was connected by this triangular road. In terms of a manor house, there is no known location of a manor house at Newtown or at Jerpoint, but I suspect it was possibly the where Jerpoint House is currently located. If this road that runs towards Old Town, it eventually curves in this direction right into Jerpoint House, and Jerpoint House is currently the Camp Hill residence, and there's this curving boundary with the next field, which is kind of suspicious also. Historically, it was the residence of the Hunts in the 18th century, and prior to that, possibly the Waltons of Walton's Grove, which is now Mount Juliet Townland. So as a best guess for where a manor house might have been within the manor of Newtown Jerpoint, that would be my best guess, but without further investigation, it's only a speculation. And then that road went further on to Old Town. So this is the townland of Old Town on the Down Survey map from the mid 17th century. Shows a couple of little buildings right here. So we don't know where the settlement at Old Town was, but I think it's a fair bet it was in this parcel of land here, because throughout the various alterations to townland boundaries, this kind of an effort was made to retain this area within the townland of Old Town. This is a townland called Glenmore, but this was all part of the Jerpoint manor previously during the medieval period. So I suspect if we were to investigate this area with geophysics, we'd possibly find the remains of Old Town, which again presumably predates Newtown as a settlement. So onto the buildings of Jerpoint, and briefly I'll just go through these two mill buildings which are on the river, and this is an earlier one. It's stone bonded with clay. So it's, again, that's the one I was pointing at before, that might be earlier than the actual town itself, potentially. There's a lot of early medieval mills in the country, so it wouldn't be unusual. This is the main one, the more intact one. It's bonded with lime mortar. It's certainly the medieval mill. And these are the various modified waterways, the leats or mill races and tail race that served the mill houses. The geophysics showed some more buildings within the mill complex, which probably a building here, the outline of the mill yard here and the laneway coming down, which could be investigated in the future. And then St. Nicholas's Parish Church, which is a fantastic building that's really well preserved and intact. And all of this tower was pretty heavily covered with ivy up until 2011, I think it was. It was removed, so that allowed a closer look at the fabric. And it seemed to me that the building was constructed over 3 phases from 13th to the 15th century. So it started off as a 2-cell building, a simple nave and chancel, roughly hewn stone, uncut rubble stone bonded with lime mortar, with pointed arched doors and windows opposing north and south doors in the nave, which was typical of the early English style. Tall lancet window in the west gable of the nave. Just go a bit faster because of not too much time left. One of the interesting things was when the ivy was taken off, it exposed this surviving plasterwork. And this would have been originally the gable, the east gable of the nave, the interior face. And the plasterwork shows an impression of the timber roof truss. So we were able to pretty clearly pick apart this, and you have the impression of the rafters, the collar beam, straight solus brace roof truss, which and then possibly where these little corners are blocked up here later on. This probably held the purline beam, which would have spanned the roof and tied it all together. So this is the kind of roof carpentry that you would have been looking at in the medieval period, which is it's pretty unique survival. It's nice. Then from the 4th and probably early 15th century, the second phase was the typical thing to add on a bell coat, and there's a double bell coat, and you can see it here. You can see the change in stone type, which was used in the later tower, and this is the bell coat here in the middle, and that was added onto the gable of the middle wall, which is atypical enough. Usually bell coats were added onto the west gable of the nave, but this is over the central gable, or the east gable of the nave. And then a porch was added onto the north door of the nave as well. So probably the north door was used as the main door for the congregation, and the opposing door was used for maybe for the social elite, maybe for the clergy. But it's again kind of atypical, because usually it's the south door was the main door, but in this case it's the north door. But that makes sense as it was facing the town. And then probably most significantly in this phase was the addition of the groin vaulted rood screen and gallery, which is it speaks for itself. It's lovely survival. It doesn't usually, these are constructed of timber in medieval churches, and particularly parish churches, so it's an unusual survival. And it housed two little chantry chapels inside. Surviving plasterwork shows where wicker was used as to support the arches while the mortar was drying. And then the third phase in the 15th century was probably the crudest phase, but the most kind of visually impressive in a way, the residential tower with a new double bell coat. So the old one was blocked up, a new bell coat put on top. So this is a 3-story, 1, 2, 3, and a parapet level. And it was constructed of red sandstone, which is local as well, but it really makes it stand out from the earlier fabric, which makes picking apart the architecture a lot easier. It was able to see quite clearly which parts were kind of dating to this same phase of building, and this buttress here as well. So that also, when that was built, it also blocked up 2 of the arches of the rood screen, which was kind of unfortunate, and it possibly blocked up the gallery itself. So the gallery would have been used, obviously, as a rood gallery, would have been used to display a cross, probably a timber cross, and might have also been somewhere where the priest could address the congregation. But it would have all been enclosed by this tower, this residential tower for the priest. The window in the chancel was also rebuilt at this time, and they put in matching custogy limestone windows into the chancel to match the windows of the residential tower. And just more examples of these large buttresses used to support the naves, the corner of the nave wall. Loads of more architectural details there, but I won't bore you all with it. It's getting time. So the desertion of Newtown Jerpoint then, which was probably most famous for being a deserted medieval village, and it the population was healthy in the start of the 14th century, and it could have peaked. I mean, there's a reference to 54 burgesses within the town in 1307. It's a large number, because in 1289 there were only 25, and it goes back down to 25 afterwards. So it might have been hit by the plague during the Black Death in the mid 14th century. It's difficult to say exactly how many people died in a place like Jerpoint, but statistics from other places just suggest 40 to 50% in some large urban areas. So it could explain why this number drops again. So there's no question, probably, well, there is some question, it's not certain, there's no records, but it's likely that the plague would have affected a place like Jerpoint. But a lot of people do jump to the conclusion that a deserted place was hit by the plague, and that's the reason why it's a deserted town. But the town obviously did survive and retained its status. Also in the 14th century, there is records of raids and killing. 24 men in total killed in a raid on Thomastown and Jerpoint. That's going to take its toll on a small place. But the town did receive a pontage grant or a murage grant in 1375. They weren't allowed to build a wall, but they were allowed to maintain the bridge and build a tower over the bridge for security. 15th century, then it still retains its status. This is mainly relying on historical records to try and chart the population through the period. So, the town had the privilege of being taxed in 1420 along with several other principal towns of Kilkenny, so it was still up there with the other boroughs of Kilkenny in the early 15th century. The town's population appears to have remained relatively stable throughout the 15th century. We have again back down to 24 shillings, which if you think each shilling represents one burgess, we have a population of again about 25 people in 1465, and it's the same in 1472. But in the 16th century, it does seem to have gone into decline. So, upon the death of poor old James Butler, who was poisoned over in London in 1546, it's recorded that the holdings in the town were worth 26 shillings and 8, or at least that's what was expected to be paid for holding the town, Newtown Jerpoint, 26 shillings and 8 pence. But it doesn't say that there were that many burgesses paying that rent. So perhaps there weren't, but by the end of the 16th century, there were only 8 tenants recorded living on the long street, and the same numbers again recorded in 1614. So within this century, the population definitely declined significantly. And the dissolution of the Abbey, of Jerpoint Abbey, is probably a large part to do with it. Although the town and the Abbey were in two distinct political territories, they had a close relationship, probably relating to trade and relating to whatever produce the Abbey was selling at the market, sheep's wool and that kind of thing. As I say here, Newtown's main function was as a node on the land route, which enabled the dispersal of goods from Thomastown inland. And then when the market started to go downhill, purpose for the town existing obviously started to decline. The loss of the Abbey, must have been a blow to the market within the town, reduced traffic crossing the bridge. Another point to mention as well, which the Marshall family, not related to Earl William Marshall, but a merchant family, which lived in Thomastown as well. They had possessions in the town, and they had a plot called Marshall's Court, which I suspect is the site of the ruins of a tower house. They didn't include an image in this, but there's a ruins, very little remains of it, a tower house in the town, and that was probably Marshall's Court. And they were a merchant family. But at the time of the dissolution of the monastery, the Abbey actually held Marshall's Court, which suggests that those people had already left by the time that happened in the mid 16th century. So maybe it had lost its kind of social elite at that point. Newtown Jerpoint, so it did hang on as a village or a hamlet for much of the 1600s. So again, as I said, in 1614, 8 people living on the long street. Here in 1653, a small castle, a corn mill in repair, a pigeon house and several thatched cabins. So there wasn't much left. It had definitely fallen from grace, so to speak. If we look at the maps, so we're really relying now on map evidence and what little historical records there are relating to Newtown Jerpoint, because it's no longer something that finds its way into the records too much anyway at this point. This map, the Down Survey map, It shows the route still passing through Newtown. So, but the bridge is gone. So that's the bridge, that's the Thomastown Bridge. But it definitely shows the line of the route from Carrick-on-Suir, still passing through Newtown, going to Thomastown. It's also notable that there's no depiction of the bridge at New Ross because it was destroyed in the battle between the Royalists and the Confederates, and it wasn't rebuilt till towards the end of the 18th century. So the fact that there's no bridge here doesn't mean the route might have still, as I said, it was a natural ford. It was obviously still the route going to Thomastown at this point in time. And then towards the end of the century, in the 1680s, there's a record which I found in the Ormond family papers of Piers Tobin, who was the tenant of Jerpoint Manor at the time. And he was complaining about the extents of the land, and it didn't add up to what he had on the ground and what he was paying for and that kind of thing. But one of the interesting things is he mentions burgesses who, as far as he was concerned, still owed suit to the mill, and he requested that their querns, because they were milling their own corn at home, which was against the law, so he requested for their querns to be destroyed by the sheriff of the manor. So that all implies that he also complained that the mill was in disrepair and he didn't have the resources to repair it. So it all implies that the kind of manorial setup was still hanging on, and that he still expected the same customs to be upheld, and that there were still burgesses living there, even if it's just by name at that time. And this is the 1680s, so it's quite late. But then by 1693, we can see that road coming from Carrick through Knocktover. Now it's diverted. It's no longer going through Jerpoint or Newtown. It's crossing over the Argyll at Goats Bridge, and then onwards past the Abbey to Thomastown. So that's probably really spells the end of any occupation in the town. And at this time, we're getting to the end of the 17th century. Land ownership in the county had changed a lot. Right, up to the end of the century, you have the Cromwellian Wars and the Williamite Wars at the end of the century. And as I say, land ownership had changed a lot. And if you don't have a bridge here, you've no route going through, you've no market, there's no real purpose. And I can imagine that was the point in time where the landlord at the time was, possibly removed what few people were still living in the town from the village, and the road was diverted, and there was no reason to rebuild the bridge, which was lost previous to this. So this is just again skipping forward to 1777, the Taylor and Skinner road map. You can see clearly where the road was coming from Knocktover and where it would have gone down through Jerpoint. This is the ruin of the church depicted here, and it would have carried on here to Thomastown, but then it's diverted across the Little Argyll at Goats Bridge, and that's where the road went there. So in summary, that is it. Jerpoint was founded during William Marshall's reorganisation of Kilkenny, if not by William Marshall. It was intended to secure the fording point and connect the west and southwest of the county to the north trade route via Thomastown. The parish church was constructed over 3 phases, from 13th to the 15th century, and the town declined in the 16th century, likely due to the decline of the market, the loss of the bridge as well, and was deserted by the end of the 17th century. Thank you.